All right, so in this lesson, we are going to talk about null checks because too many developers are doing this mistake and I really want you to avoid it. Now, doing null checks within your app is really good. It basically prevents your app from crashing and you have to do it. It will prevent you from having those null pointer exception within your app and it will save your app from being a total disaster. I agree with that. Now, it's also important to know when to do null checks. You don't want to go and add null checks wherever in the app, like all over the place. That's not a good strategy. And that's what we are going to be talking now. So if you go in our project in the restaurant response, you can see that we have some of the fields that are nullable. So basically this question mark means that this variable can be null. And if you have this kind of scenario where you have a field that can be null, like we have here with the restaurant that we get from the server, we know that this name here, this string, can come null from the server. The image URL is the same story. This can come as null as well. And it's really good for you to check if the name or if the image URL are null or not within the app. So this is a very good idea. And this is a positive example on where to use null checks and when it's appropriate to do so. So if it's not dependent to you, if it's something that comes from the server, if you scan a QR code and for some reason there's an exception, you should catch it. Or in this case, you should do this null check because you don't know whether the server will throw you a null name or if you'll send you a null image URL. Now, there's also a bad example and we have this in the app. So let's minimize this. If you go here in the display restaurants method and scroll down to the adapter, we see that we get the adapter and then we check if it's not null. And only then we set the restaurants to it and the click listener itself. Let's have a quick look at this adapter and see what happens with it. We can see that we have a variable, instance variable for the activity, which we declare initially as null. So we see that this adapter can be null and the initial value is null. Now, in the onCreate method, in this callback, which basically means that the app has started and it's going to be visible at some point, we initialize this adapter. So we basically assign an instance of this adapter to our restaurants adapter variable. So in this onCreate, we make sure that this adapter is not going to be null. Now, 10 lines or 8 lines, 9 lines later, what we do, we basically call show restaurants, and this show restaurants starts the request from the network and then all this cool logic happens. In the end, the display restaurants is triggered. So if you press Ctrl B so we can get back to this method here, as you can see, we check for the adapter if it's null or not. Now this is a bad idea because even though the restaurant adapter can be null, we know that at this point our adapter should not be null because we have instantiated in the onCreate method. So when the request for the server for the restaurants is done and the restaurants come to you and you have to display them, you know that the adapter cannot be null. So instead of checking here if the adapter is null, you should actually do something smarter. So let's remove this null check here. All right, and now let's also refactor the code a bit. And now what we have to do is basically, in Java, you can basically just don't check anything, just not check anything. But in Kotlin, we have to tell the compiler that the ID that, hey, this adapter is not going to be null, and also here. But here is kind of redundant because we already did it on the previous line. Now, if you do this, you basically tell not only Android Studio that, hey, this adapter cannot be null at this point in code, but also you tell your code at execution at runtime that this adapter should not be null. Now you're gonna say, but why should we do this? What's the harm with that with that check? Well, let's make a exercise. Let's go and imagine, so an imagination exercise, let's imagine that a colleague of yours comes and refactors your code. And I don't know, for some reason, he accidentally removes this line where the adapter is instantiated. And what happens is that when the restaurants will come, because you had a null check here, so previously we had that if here, if the adapter is not null, do something. So because of this if, the app will not crash, but it wouldn't show any restaurants either, because the adapter would be null, because your colleague just removed that instantiation line in onCreate callback. So the app would run, but it wouldn't show any restaurants. And you might be saying, but it's better to run than to crash, right? Well, not so much, because what you do here, if you put this kind of check here with a nullability, you basically plant a landmine. So in the future, when a bug arises like this one that I just told you about with your colleague that deletes that line, you basically will need to spend more time investigating what's wrong. And it will probably take more time to see that your colleague has deleted that line. And that's why here the adapter is null and the restaurants are not being displayed. Now, if we go with our approach, with this approach, which is really known as, it's called fail fast. Basically, what happens here, so we might as well just remove this soon. What happens here, the app is going to basically crash, and it's going to say that, hey, this adapter, you just told me, programmer, you told me that this adapter is not going to be null, but it was not null, but it was null. So there's something wrong with your logic here. You're telling me that this is not null, but it was null. So I'm going to crash the app, and you get a null pointer exception. If that happens, that's actually better, because if the app crashes soon, so you have that fail fast mindset, you can discover the bug really soon and you can fix it. And you know where the problem is. You basically instantly understand that the adapter was null and it was not supposed to be null. So as a rule of thumb, you should be doing this. You should be trying to explicitly tell your code that some variables should not be null at some point within your code. If you're doing so, if the app crashes for some reason, you won't have to debug that much, because you will see in the stack trace where it crashed. You'll understand the problem really quickly, and chances are you'll solve it much sooner. So I really recommend you to go on this fail fast mindset, because it will basically prevent you from planting landmines. Now, this was a very good example, because we know that we have instantiated the adapter and the adapter should not be null here. So this is a good guideline for you. If you have a variable and it was null at some point, but when you get the data or at just some point within your app, you know that it should not be null, well, treat it as a non-nullable variable. Tell Android Studio that this is not going to be null, because that's the way you have thought your logic. That was the thought process that you have followed when you wrote the logic. So do this, and you'll have a very fail-fast code, which will allow you to find bugs really fast. Now, let's refactor this. And instead of having an adapter, let's actually call this directly on our instance variable here. And it's going to complain with the same stuff here, telling me that this can be null. But we know that this is not null. This cannot be null at the time that we receive the restaurants, because we have instantiated the variable. Now, we should also probably revert the line here that we just had. So we should come back here and say restaurant adapter like this equals 1 second. So let's call this a restaurant adapter like that. So what we did here, we had this line. Let's move it a bit higher, because this is not where it should be. It should be here. This is where we deleted from. So we have reverted the code. And the idea is that you should not always do this. So I told you that you should treat these kind of values as non-nullable, because that was the way that you have thought your logic. But going back to our initial example here, when there are cases that you cannot control, so they are not part of your logic, like here, with the name of the restaurant that comes from the server, you should do null checks. So it's really important for you to understand when you should do them and when you should not do them. With doing so, you can prevent having bugs, and also your app will not crash. Now, let's do a bit of a quick summary, a bit of a quick revision on what we have just learned.